There's a ton of noise out there. So how do you get decision makers to pay attention to your brand? Start a podcast and invite your ideal clients to be guests on your show. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show.
Welcome back to B2B Growth. I'm your host for today's episode, Logan Lyles with Sweetfish Media. Today is going to be another episode in our How to Podcast series. So I am going to be talking about a question that we get a lot as we're talking to brands, thinking about, are they going to start a podcast? And one of the first questions that comes up, if we start a podcast, who is going to be our host? So as I'm having these conversations, there are normally three criteria or three things to think about that I'm recommending and I'm hearing from marketing teams that they're thinking about in deciding on who is going to be their host. Number one is who's going to be an engaging host, who has the personality for it. Two, who's got the clout or the industry recognition or the name. And three is who has the time. So I'll go into these a little bit more in detail and how we think about you should really prioritize them. So number one, who's going to be an engaging host? You know, on B2B Growth, we have actually had multiple co-hosts over the years. And what we found is that, you know, some people have a different style. Some people are a little bit, you know, more boisterous. Some people are a little bit more low key. I think I'm more on the low key side. And one of the things that I always tell people is my personal story of becoming a podcast host. So I'm fairly introverted for folks that know me. I have a journalism background, but that was in photography, not radio or broadcast. I had no broadcast or really public speaking training before I became a host of a daily show, which most of our customers are not jumping in the deep end and doing a daily show. And so one of the encouragements that I talk to people about there is that you don't need a radio superstar on your team in order to have a successful podcast host. They need to be able to hold a conversation, obviously. But what we found is that if you give someone a framework for how to do an effective pre-interview conversation, give them a framework for a solid intro and outro that they can use consistently, that takes away some of the nerves. And what I found is that for a lot of people, getting up to a podcast mic is way easier than stepping in front of a camera or stepping up on stage. I love hosting podcast interviews. I do not love speaking from stage. So I don't think that that is the number one criteria, but I do see a lot of people get hung up on that. So those are some thoughts there on who might be an engaging host. Number two is who's got the clout, who's got the name recognition. A lot of times with new shows, we talk with marketing teams that are thinking, hey, I would love our CEO or someone on our executive team has some name recognition within the industry. One of the problems there, though, is making that your top criteria could be that that person doesn't have the amount of time needed to stay consistent. So while that can be effective, it can maybe help you land a few extra guests that you wouldn't be able to otherwise. It might not be the number one criteria. So that actually leads me to number three that we think is the number one criteria you should think about in who is going to be your podcast host. As long as one and two are okay, then who has the time? Who is going to be able to record the interviews? Now, again, comparing podcasting to public speaking or maybe webinars, you can block schedule. You can, conduct interviews at certain times back to back to back. And so we found that even some busy executives can find the time for knocking out podcast interviews without it eating into their schedule and travel and all that sort of stuff as much as possible. But that leads me to a recommendation that we're making a lot of times, and that is maybe you have a mixture of people. You have people who maybe don't have as engaging a personality, but they have more time. Or you have someone who has the clout, the industry recognition, but not quite as much time. Make multiple people on your team co-hosts, because then you're investing in the personal brand of multiple people on your team. You're giving listeners a rhythm and a change up to where it's not always the same host, and you're making it easier on your team for the time investment. So I think about all three of those, and we do as a team, as the criteria for who's going to be the podcast host. And again, the time might be the number one criteria, with a little bit mixed in of who's got the personality for it, who has the clout for it. But don't think that you have to have one person that covers all three bases and is a 10 out of 10 on all of them, because you might be able to create a mixture of all three of these that give you the recipe for success in who or what members of your team are going to become the host or the co-hosts of your podcast. So again, think about who's got the personality, who has the recognition, and most importantly, who's got the time to realistically be able to do this. Because if you don't have the time, then the other ones don't matter, because they won't be able to actually record any interviews. So I hope this was helpful for folks. I shared it on LinkedIn recently, and we thought, have to make this into an episode here on our How to Podcast series. If you want more episodes like this, go to sweetfishmedia.com/blog and look for the How to Podcast hashtag in the categories, or just look for this hashtag in the feed here in B2B Growth. As always, I'd love to connect with our listeners on LinkedIn. Just look me up. I think I'm the only Logan Lyles, Lyles. Also trying to up our Instagram game as a team lately. On Instagram, I'm at I am Logan Lyles. As always, thank you so much for listening.
We totally get it. We publish a ton of content on this podcast, and it can be a lot to keep up with. That's why we've started the B2B Growth Big Three, a no-fluff email that boils down our three biggest takeaways from an entire week of episodes. Sign up today at sweetfishmedia.com/big3. That's sweetfishmedia.com/big3.